The moment Jennie Ford rode into Dusty Creek, New Mexico territory, with nothing but a carpetbag, a loaded derringer, and a deed to land that half the town wanted to take from her, she knew her life was about to become something she could not have predicted even in her most vivid dreams. It was the spring of 1878, and the territory was still raw in the way that only the Southwest could be raw, where the red earth cracked under a sun so unrelenting it seemed to have a personal grudge against anything that dared to grow. Dusty Creek was not much of a town. There was a general store run by a man named Elias Pump, who had a habit of shortchanging customers, and a wider habit of pretending he had not done it. There was a saloon called the Copper Penny that smelled of sawdust and bad decisions. There was a livery, a jail, a small church that leaned slightly to the left as though it had grown tired of standing straight, and a scattering of homes and farms that fanned out from the main road like spokes on a wheel that had not quite been put together right. Jennie was 24 years old, dark-haired, and possessed of a quality that people often mistook for fearlessness, but which was, in truth, something closer to desperation dressed up in a steady gaze. She had come to Dusty Creek because her uncle, a man named Harold Ford who had left Philadelphia for the territory 20 years ago and apparently never looked back, had died and left her his 40-acre ranch. She had never met Harold Ford. She had received exactly 3 letters from him in her entire life, but the deed had arrived at her door in a legal envelope, and the lawyer's note inside had been clear. The land was hers, free and clear, and all she had to do was come and claim it. What the lawyer's note had not mentioned was that a man named Roscoe Dant had been using that land for 3 years, grazing his cattle on it and fixing the fence posts with his own lumber. And Roscoe Dant did not appear to have any intention of letting a woman from Philadelphia tell him to pack up and leave. She heard about Roscoe Dant in the first 10 minutes of her arrival, because the man who helped her down from the stagecoach, a broad-shouldered fellow with a kind face and flour on his apron who turned out to be the town baker, had looked at her bag, looked at her face, and said, "You must be Harold Ford's niece." And when she confirmed that she was, his expression had shifted into something that was halfway between sympathy and concern. "You are going to want to talk to Clyde Alden before you do anything else," the baker, whose name was Amos, told her. "He is the only man in this town that Roscoe Dant respects even a little, and that is mostly because Clyde does not back down from anything." She had thanked Amos and asked where she might find this Clyde Alden, and Amos had pointed toward the livery at the far end of the road and told her that Clyde was most likely there, since he spent most of his mornings working horses. Jennie had picked up her carpetbag and walked the length of Dusty Creek's main road, aware that people were watching her from doorways and windows with the particular intensity that small towns reserved for strangers. She did not hurry. She had learned, growing up in a house where showing weakness invited more of it, that the pace at which you moved told people everything about how they ought to treat you. She heard him before she saw him. There was a sharp whistle, clean and commanding, and then the sound of hooves striking packed dirt, and then a voice, low and unhurried, saying, "Easy now, easy. Nobody is rushing you." She stepped into the shadow of the livery doorway and saw a man standing in the center of a small corral attached to the side of the building, holding a lead rope attached to a young chestnut mare that was rolling her eyes and stamping her feet like she had been personally offended by the rope's existence. The man was tall, maybe an inch or 2 over 6 feet, with dark blonde hair that the wind had thoroughly disorganized, and a jaw that looked like it had been designed for stubbornness. He was wearing a worn leather vest over a blue cotton shirt, and his boots were the kind that had been resoled at least twice and would probably be resoled again, because a man like that wore a thing until it had nothing left to give. He had not noticed her yet. He was entirely focused on the mare, and there was something in the way he watched the horse that Jennie found unexpectedly arresting. He was not dominating the animal. He was reasoning with her. He was patient, and the patience was not the strained kind that people perform when they are secretly furious. It appeared to be genuine. "Mr. Alden," she said. He turned, and she saw his face clearly for the first time. He was perhaps 28 or 29, with blue-gray eyes that were direct without being aggressive and a mouth that looked like it was accustomed to staying quiet until it had something worth saying. "That is me," he said. He did not step closer, but he turned to face her fully, which felt like its own kind of attention. "And you are?" "Jennie Ford," she said. "Harold Ford's niece. I have just arrived on the stage from Santa Fe, and I have been told you are the person I ought to speak with before I speak with anyone else." He studied her for a moment, the mare bumping his shoulder with her nose as though annoyed at the interruption. He absently reached up and scratched the mare between the ears without looking at her, and the mare's stamping slowed. "You have come about the land," he said. "I have. And you know about Roscoe Dant." "I have been informed." He looped the lead rope around the corral post and came to the fence, resting his forearms on the top rail and looking at her with an expression she could not quite categorize. It was not dismissive, which she had been prepared for. It was not pitying, which she had been braced against. It was something more like careful assessment, the way a person looks at a problem they are genuinely interested in solving. "Roscoe Dant is not a violent man," he said, "but he is a determined one, and he has 3 ranch hands who are both of those things. He has been under the impression that your uncle's land would go to the territory if no one claimed it, and he was planning to buy it at county auction next month." "Well, someone claimed it," Jennie said. "So I see." Something shifted in his expression, something that might have been the distant ancestor of a smile. "Do you have the deed on you?" "I do." "Good. Keep it on you always, not in your bag, in your coat or your boot." He paused. "Do you have a place to stay tonight?" "I assumed I would stay at my uncle's house." "The house on the Ford property has been empty for 2 years," he said. "It will need some work before it is livable. Mrs. Garrett at the end of the second road takes in boarders. She is honest and her cooking is good. I would recommend her." "Thank you," Jennie said, and she meant it without reservation, which was not something she offered often to people she had known for less than 3 minutes. She had been about to turn away when he spoke again. "Miss Ford," he said, and she turned back. "Do not go out to the Ford property alone. Not until Dant knows you are here and knows you are serious. I will go with you if you like tomorrow morning." She considered him. A week ago in Philadelphia, the idea of accepting help from a stranger in a strange place would have made her cautious. Out here, standing in the red dust with the sun coming down hard, and the knowledge that a determined man was already occupying the land that was supposed to be her future, she was practical enough to know that pride was a luxury she could not currently afford. "Tomorrow morning," she agreed. "I will meet you here." She left the livery and went to find Mrs. Garrett, and the whole way there she was aware of a feeling she could not quite name, something that sat in her chest like a warm coal, unexpected and not entirely unwelcome. Mrs. Garrett turned out to be a stout, cheerful widow in her 50s who had opinions about everything and kept them all, and who fed Jennie a supper of beef stew and cornbread, and asked only a moderate number of questions before letting her go to bed in a room that smelled of lavender and wood polish. Jennie lay in the narrow bed and looked at the ceiling and thought about 40 acres of land she had never seen, about an uncle she had never met, about a man in a livery who scratched horses between the ears without thinking about it. She got up in the dark the next morning, dressed, ate the eggs and salt pork Mrs. Garrett put in front of her, tucked the deed into her boot exactly as Clyde had instructed, and walked to the livery in the pale pre-dawn light with her chin up and her hand steady. He was already there. He had 2 horses saddled and waiting, a big gray for himself and a smaller bay mare that he indicated was for her. He did not ask if she could ride. He simply assumed she could, which she appreciated more than she could have expressed. They rode out of town in the early morning quiet, the desert waking up around them in shades of amber and pink, the distant mountains still purple with shadow. It was the most beautiful landscape Jennie had ever seen, and she hated herself a little for thinking that, because she was supposed to be scared and practical, not quietly moved by the color of mountains in the morning. "Tell me about my uncle," she said after a while. Clyde rode with the ease of a man who had grown up in a saddle, and he was quiet for a moment before he answered. "Harold Ford was a quiet man," he said. "Came out here from the east like a lot of people, looking for something different. He was a good neighbor, kept his fences and did not let his cattle onto other people's land. He died of a fever last winter, went fast. Did he have friends here? A few. He and my father used to play cards on Thursday evenings." He paused. "My father passed 2 years ago. Harold kept the tradition alive with a couple of the other older ranchers. I think he was lonelier than he let on." Jennie absorbed that. She thought about the 3 letters, written in a cramped, careful hand that suggested a man who had not written much. She had always assumed she had been the distant one, the niece who had never made the journey. But maybe Harold had been distant too, in his own way. Maybe they had been alike without ever knowing it. "Why did he leave me the land?" she asked. "I could not say for certain," Clyde said, "but I think he may not have had anyone else. And maybe he wanted it to go to someone who needed a real chance rather than someone who would just sell it." She thought about that for the rest of the ride. The Ford property appeared on the horizon as a cluster of weathered structures surrounded by open grazing land that rolled out in all directions toward a line of low hills. The grass was thinning in places from Dant's cattle, but it was not destroyed. The house itself was a 2-room structure of adobe and wood that had settled unevenly into the earth, but still stood with a certain dignity. The barn needed its roof repaired. The corral fence was down in 2 places. And standing near the fence, watching them approach with arms crossed and an expression that suggested he had been expecting trouble and had decided to be the trouble first, was a heavy-set man in his 40s with a thick gray-brown mustache and the weathered look of someone who had spent 4 decades making the land bend to his will. Roscoe Dant. He had 2 men with him, one on either side, both wearing the blank expressions of people who were paid to look threatening. Clyde brought his horse to a stop about 10 yards from Dant and sat easy in the saddle, one hand resting on his thigh and the other holding the reins loosely. Jennie pulled up beside him. "Alden," Dant said. His voice was graveled and flat. "Roscoe," Clyde said, "just the name, no more." Dant's eyes moved to Jennie with the look of a man who had already decided what she was before she opened her mouth. "This is Harold Ford's niece," Clyde said. "Miss Jennie Ford. She has the deed to this property. She has come to take possession." "Harold Ford's niece," Dant repeated, as though the concept were faintly ridiculous. "Woman comes all the way from back east on account of some old man's property." "Woman comes all the way from back east on account of her own property," Jennie said, and her voice was clear and steady and did not carry even a tremor of apology. "The deed is registered in Santa Fe. The land is mine. I do not want any trouble, Mr. Dant, but I want what belongs to me." Something moved in Dant's eyes, surprise maybe. She got the impression that women in Dusty Creek did not often speak to him that way. "You've been using her land for 3 years, Clyde said to Dant, still with that same easy, unhurried tone. "You have had good use of it. Now it is time to move your cattle off." "I put work into this land," Dant said, and there was a hard edge in his voice now. "I repaired those outbuildings. I kept those fences from falling completely to pieces. Any court in the territory will acknowledge that," Clyde said. "If she is reasonable, she may choose to compensate you for that work. But the land is hers, and the cattle have to go." Dant looked at Jennie for a long moment, and she held his gaze the way she had been holding difficult gazes since she was 9 years old and had learned that looking away was always more costly than holding on. "I will have my cattle off in 3 days, Dant said at last, and the words came out like something being pried loose. "But do not expect any kindness from me, Miss Ford. This was my land to buy, and everybody in this county knows it. Everybody in this county knows the deed is registered in Santa Fe," she replied, equally quiet. "And that is what matters." Dant turned and walked away, his 2 men falling into step behind him, and Jennie did not let herself breathe fully until all 3 of them had crested the low rise behind the barn and disappeared. "That went better than I expected," Clyde said. "He is angry," she said. "He is. But Roscoe Dant is a man who respects plain dealing even when it goes against him. He will honor what he said." He glanced at her with something she could only call appreciation, open and unguarded. "You did well." Most people, first time they face down Dant, they flinch. "I have been flinching at things my whole life," she said. "I decided to stop." She was not sure why she told him that. It was more honest than she usually was with people she had just met. But something about the way Clyde Alden moved through the world, without performance or pretense, made her feel like honesty was the only sensible currency to use. They spent the better part of the morning walking the property together, Clyde pointing out what needed the most urgent repair, and Jennie making a mental list that grew longer and more daunting as the morning wore on. The house needed new window shutters, several roof tiles replaced, and the interior needed a thorough cleaning after 2 years of emptiness. The well needed to be checked. The barn roof, as she had noted, was a problem. The kitchen garden had gone entirely to weeds, but the land itself was sound. The soil was good. There was a creek on the eastern edge of the property that ran clear and steady, and standing in the middle of it with the wind moving through the dry grass and the mountains standing up blue against the sky, Jennie felt something that she had not felt in a very long time. She felt like she was exactly where she was supposed to be. She bought supplies from Elia's pump that afternoon, being careful to count her change, and she hired a local man named Pete Castillo, who Clyde recommended as both honest and skilled with a hammer to help with the repairs. She spent the next 3 nights at Mrs. Garrett's while Pete worked on the house, and on the 3rd night, Clyde came by Mrs. Garrett's porch in the evening and told her that Dant's cattle were off the land, and the gate to the south pasture had been shut and tied. "He kept his word," she said. "He generally does," Clyde said. He had taken his hat off and was holding it in one hand, which was a small gesture that she noticed, and that she thought was probably unconscious. He was leaning against the porch post with that ease that seemed native to him. "How is the work coming along?" "Pete says I can move in the day after tomorrow," she said. "Good." He was quiet a moment, looking out at the road. The evening light was turning everything the color of honey. "Miss Ford, I want to say something, and I want you to take it in the spirit it is meant." She looked at him, curious. "This is not an easy place for a woman alone," he said, and he said it without condescension, with the same plain honesty she had heard in him from the beginning. "Not because women cannot manage it. I have known women out here who could run a ranch better than most men I know. But it is hard work, and it is isolated, and the winter is harder than anything you will have experienced in Philadelphia. If you find yourself needing help, I would ask you not to be too proud to ask for it. Are you offering specifically?" She said, and she said it lightly, but she meant it as a genuine question. He turned to look at her, and there was a moment between them that was different from all the previous moments, a moment that had a quality of stillness to it, like the air before a change in the weather. "I am offering specifically," he said. She nodded. "Then I will not be too proud to ask." He put his hat back on and said good evening and walked away down the road, and Mrs. Garrett appeared in the doorway behind Jennie with 2 cups of coffee and a knowing expression. "Clyde Alden," Mrs. Garrett said, handing her a cup, "is the best man in this valley. His mother raised him after his father died, and she raised him right. He has been working horses and doing odd jobs since he was 15, and he has never once done anything that made a person sorry to have trusted him." "You seem to know him well," Jennie said. "Everybody in Dusty Creek knows Clyde Alden," Mrs. Garrett said. "He is the kind of person a town needs and does not always appreciate until he is gone." She sipped her coffee. "Just saying." Jennie sipped her own coffee and did not say anything, but the warm coal that had been sitting in her chest since the livery shifted and glowed a little brighter. She moved into the Ford house 4 days after arriving in Dusty Creek, and it was harder and lonelier than she had expected, which was saying something because she had expected it to be hard and lonely. The first night she lay in the dark and listened to sounds she did not recognize: the creak of the wood, the distant sound of something moving in the grass outside, the enormous silence that lay over the desert like a blanket, and she told herself very firmly that she was not going to cry. She did not cry. She got up instead, lit the lamp, and made a list of everything she needed to do the next day, and the day after that, and the list was long enough that by the time she finished it she felt purposeful instead of afraid, which was close enough to fine. In the weeks that followed, she worked from sunup to sundown. She learned quickly that 40 acres of land required constant attention, that the idea of just living there quietly was a fantasy that belonged to a person who did not understand what land actually was. She planted the kitchen garden. She repaired the fence of the smaller corral herself, learning from Pete Castillo, who was a patient teacher and clearly found her determination amusing in a fond way. She acquired 2 chickens and a milk cow from a widow on the northern edge of town who was selling off her livestock. Clyde came by every 3 or 4 days. It was never arranged. He simply appeared, sometimes in the morning with a question about whether she needed lumber or wire from the general store since he was going anyway. Sometimes in the evening when the work was done, sitting on the step of the porch with a cup of coffee that she made and talking about the land and the weather and the small things that made up life in Dusty Creek. She looked forward to those visits with an honesty she did not bother to disguise to herself, because there was no point in being dishonest with yourself about the things that made the days lighter. One afternoon in her 2nd month, he helped her clear the irrigation ditch on the eastern side of the property, where a blockage had been building up and threatening to back water toward the house. They worked side by side in the heat, up to their boots in mud, and it was not glamorous work. She lost her footing on the slick bottom of the ditch twice, and he caught her arm both times without making a production of it, just steady and quick, the way a person catches something that matters. When they had cleared the blockage and climbed out and were standing in the sun drying off and catching their breath, he looked at her with mud on his jaw and she looked at him, and they both started laughing at exactly the same moment, the kind of laughter that comes from genuine delight rather than anything that has been performed. "You have mud on your face," he said. "You have mud everywhere else," she replied. He wiped his jaw with his sleeve, which only spread the mud, and she laughed again. And the sound of it surprised her because she could not remember the last time she had laughed that way, without reservation, without worrying about what it looked like. He was looking at her when she stopped laughing, and his expression had the quality of someone who has just seen something they had not expected to see and are not yet sure what to do with it. "Jennie," he said. It was the first time he had used her given name. She had noticed. "Clyde," she said, same tone. They stood there in the sun for a moment, and then he said, "I need to get back. I have a horse to work before evening." "Of course," she said. He collected his tools and rode away, and she stood at the fence watching him go and trying to be sensible about the fact that her heart was behaving in a way that could not be attributed to the afternoon's exertion. The following Sunday, Dusty Creek held its once-a-month community gathering in the open ground beside the church, where families brought food and people traded news, and the younger population of the town found excuses to stand near each other. Jennie went because Mrs. Garrett insisted, and because she had realized that being part of this community was not optional if she wanted to build a real life here. She met people she had not yet had occasion to meet. She met the Ray's family, who had a farm 2 miles to the south of her property, and their daughter Maria, who was 17 and serious, and clearly destined for something larger than Dusty Creek. She met the school teacher, a sharp-eyed woman named Clara Briggs who had come from Ohio and who shook Jennie's hand like she meant it. She met the town's doctor, a thin, tired-looking man named Hollies who told her that if she ever needed anything medically, she should come to him, and not to the man in the next county who called himself a doctor, and whose primary qualification appeared to be owning a bag. And she saw Clyde, who was helping move tables with 2 other men and who saw her across the gathering and raised a hand in greeting, and she raised a hand back, and it was such a simple exchange, and yet she felt it down to her boots. Later, when the food had been eaten and the light was going gold, he came and stood beside her at the edge of the gathering, and they talked about nothing in particular. About the quality of Mrs. Jensen's apple pie, which was exceptional. About the report that someone in the next county had been having trouble with cattle thieves. About the schoolteacher's campaign for a new building to replace the current classroom, which was apparently held together by faith and very old nails. "How are you settling in?" he asked, and it was a simple question, but he asked it with his full attention, the way he gave his full attention to most things. "Better than I thought I would," she said honestly. "I like the work more than I expected to. I like the feeling of something that is mine." She paused. "I like this place." "It grows on you," he said. "I left once when I was 21, went north thinking I wanted to see something different, came back after 2 years." "What brought you back?" He thought about it. "The land," he said, "and the people, and the sense that this was where I was supposed to be." He looked at her briefly. "I recognize that look, by the way." "What look?" "The one you get when you are standing on your property in the morning and the light is right and you know, without any logic to support it, that you are exactly where you are supposed to be." She stared at him. "How do you know what I look like in the morning on my property?" "I rode by last Tuesday on my way to the Ray's farm," he said, "and you were standing by the east fence looking at the mountains, and you had exactly that look." She should have been embarrassed at having been observed unaware. Instead, she felt something warm and specific that was entirely distinct from embarrassment. "I am exactly where I am supposed to be," she confirmed. He smiled then, a full smile, and she understood why Mrs. Garrett had spoken about him the way she had, because there was something in that smile that was simply and completely good. That night, walking home in the dark with a lantern in her hand, and the stars scattered extravagantly overhead, Jennie admitted to herself that she was falling in love with Clyde Alden. She admitted it clearly, the way she tried to face most things, without prettying it up or qualifying it into something safer. She was falling in love with him. She had been falling since the livery, probably, since the way he had spoken to the nervous mare with that particular patient honesty. She was not sure what to do with that. She was not sure if he felt the same way, or if she was reading meaning into gestures that were simply the gestures of a kind man. She was not sure whether, having just built the first real independent life she had ever had, it was wise to let herself want something that involved another person. But she had also decided to stop flinching, and she was going to hold herself to that. The trouble with Roscoe Dant did not go away the way she had hoped. He had honored his word about the cattle, and he had not threatened her or done anything that would give a legal complaint. But there was a pressure, subtle and consistent, that she felt from the direction of his ranch. One morning she found her south fence cut in 2 places. She could not prove it was Dant, but there was no reason for the fence to have been cut by anyone else. She repaired it herself and said nothing publicly, but she told Clyde when he came by that evening. He looked at the repaired fence and then looked at her, and she could see the tension in his jaw, controlled but real. "I will ride over to his place tomorrow," he said. "No," she said firmly. "I do not want you fighting my battles for me." "I am not fighting anything," he said. "I am having a conversation." "Clyde," she said his name the way she had learned to say it, direct and warm and with enough weight to make him listen. "I am going to go over there myself." He stared at her. "Jennie, that is not, it is my fence," she said. "It is my land. If Dant needs to understand that I am not going away, he needs to hear it from me, not from you." He was quiet for a moment, working through something in his expression that she thought was a mixture of admiration and frustration. "I would like to ride with you," he said at last. "Not to do the talking, just to ride." She considered that. "All right," she said, "just to ride." They rode to Dant's ranch the next morning, arriving in the cool of early day when Dant was in his yard checking the harness on a wagon. He looked up when he saw them, and his face settled into that closed, hard expression. Jennie dismounted and walked toward him and stopped at a respectful distance. "Mr. Dant," she said, "my south fence was cut 2 nights ago. I have repaired it. I'm not here to accuse you because I have no proof of who did it, but I want to say something to you plainly." He said nothing, but he was watching her. "I understand that you are angry," she said. "I understand that you had plans for that land that were reasonable from your perspective, and that my arrival disrupted those plans. I am not unsympathetic to that. But I am not leaving. I am going to work that land and build something on it, and I am going to be your neighbor for as long as I live. And I would very much rather be a neighbor you can tolerate than an enemy you cannot shake." Dant was still for a long moment. The morning light was direct and clean, and there was no softening it. "You are a stubborn woman, Miss Ford," he said finally. "I come by it honestly," she said. Something in his face shifted, almost imperceptibly. Not warmth, not quite, but the absence of the particular hostility that had been there before. "My man Lewis cut that fence without my knowledge or authorization," he said, and the words were stiff, but they were there. "It will not happen again," she nodded. "Then we understand each other." She turned and walked back to her horse, and when she mounted she glanced at Clyde, who was sitting his horse with the expression of a man who is not going to say "I told you so" because he is actually too impressed for that. On the ride back they were quiet for a while, the horses walking easily through the morning, and then Clyde said, "Where did you learn to do that?" "Do what?" "Talk to difficult people the way you just talked to Dant. Like you understand them even when they are being unreasonable." She thought about it. "My mother was a difficult person," she said. "Not mean, just very hard to reach. I spent a lot of years trying to find the place where she could hear me." She paused. "I do not think I ever fully succeeded with her, but I got good at trying." He was quiet for a moment that had texture to it, a thoughtful kind of quiet. "I am sorry you had to learn it that way," he said. It was such a simple thing to say, and it hit her somewhere deep and unguarded because most people, when she told them something difficult from her life, either offered advice or moved past it quickly. He had simply said he was sorry and meant it and left it there, and that was exactly right. "Thank you," she said quietly. Summer settled fully over the territory, and the days grew long and punishing and beautiful, and Jennie's land came alive in the way that land does when it is properly tended. Her garden produced enough that she had surplus to trade at the general store. The creek ran strong. She acquired a third chicken. She made friends with Maria Reyes and with Clara Briggs, the schoolteacher, and she began to feel the shape of her life here, its rhythms and textures and small joys. And always Clyde. He was there in the easy, natural way that some things come to be present without anyone deciding they should be. The way sunlight comes through a particular window at a particular hour. He was there to help when she needed help, which she had learned to ask for without the sense of debt she used to feel. He was there in the evenings, on the porch, in the comfortable silence that they had developed between them, a silence that was not empty but full, the way a room is full of the sense of a person even when the person is being quiet. She knew, with the same certainty with which she knew the land was right for her, that he felt what she felt. She saw it in the way he watched her when he thought she was not looking, in the way his voice changed when he said her name, in the small and constant acts of care that he offered with an ease that made them seem effortless even though she understood, having been around him long enough to know the shape of him, that nothing Clyde Alden did was thoughtless. But he did not say it, and she was not sure why. She found out in August, on a hot evening when they were sitting on the porch after supper, a rare occasion when she had cooked for both of them and they had eaten at the small table inside and then moved outside because the air was slightly cooler. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Always," he said. "Why do you keep coming here?" She said it without coyness, looking straight at him. "You have your own work, your own life, but you keep coming. I want to know why." He looked at her for a long moment, and she saw the thing in his face that she had seen before and that she had never been quite sure how to read. It was not uncertainty exactly. It was more like a person standing at the edge of something deciding whether they are ready to step off. "Because I want to," he said. "Clyde." "Because I cannot stay away," he said then, more quietly, and the simplicity of it was devastating. "Because I ride out in the morning and I find excuses to come this direction, and I have been doing it since the second week you were here, and I am aware of the fact that I am not subtle about it, and I am also aware that you probably know exactly what I am saying." "I know exactly what you are saying," she said. And his voice was steady, but it was working to be steady. "And I have been falling in love with you since you scratched that nervous mare between the ears in the livery," she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then, "That was the second morning you were here." "I know," she said. "You cannot help it, apparently." He stood up from his chair, and so did she, and they were standing very close on the small porch in the dark, with the stars above the desert and the smell of dry grass in the air. And he reached out and touched her face with the same careful attention he gave everything, and she leaned into his hand and closed her eyes for a moment. "Jennie," he said, and her name in his voice was like something she had been waiting to hear for years without knowing she was waiting. "I know," she said, because she did. He kissed her, and it was not dramatic in the way that people often mean dramatic. It was careful and honest and warm, the way everything about him was careful and honest and warm. And when they broke apart, they were both smiling, and she thought that this was the thing she had not known she was building toward since the day she stepped off the stagecoach in Dusty Creek with her carpetbag and her derringer and her deed. The weeks that followed had a different quality, the way the world takes on a different quality when you have said a thing that was true and had it received. Clyde came every day. Not because there was always work to do, but because they wanted to be together, and they had both stopped pretending otherwise. They talked about everything. About her life in Philadelphia, the house that had felt too small and too full of expectation, the job she had done as a seamstress that she had been good at but had never loved, the sense of having a life that fit around her like someone else's coat. About his life, growing up on his father's horse ranch, learning to read horses the way some people learn to read books, his 2 years north in Colorado where he had worked cattle and been competent and thoroughly homesick. About what they wanted, the specific and the general, the near and the far. They were easy together in the way that people who are deeply suited to each other are easy, not because they agreed about everything, because they did not, but because their disagreements were also honest and direct, and they both had the essential respect for each other that makes disagreement feel like a conversation rather than a threat. In September, Clara Briggs held a small dance at the schoolhouse to raise money for the new building, and Jennie and Clyde went together, which created a minor sensation in Dusty Creek in the pleasant way that everyone already assumed they were together and were simply glad to have confirmation. He danced with her twice, which was the politely sanctioned maximum for an unmarried couple, and both times she was aware of how his hand sat at her waist, and how they moved together with an ease that should not have existed between people who had never danced together before, but which made complete sense given that they had been in a kind of ongoing conversation about each other for months. Between the dances, she danced with Amos the baker, who stepped on her foot twice and apologized each time with enormous sincerity, and with Pete Castillo, who was a surprisingly graceful dancer. She talked to Maria Reyes, who had decided she wanted to become a teacher and was asking Clara Briggs about what training she would need. She talked to Mrs. Garrett, who told her with great satisfaction that she was looking well and that Dusty Creek suited her. "It does," Jennie said, and looked across the room to where Clyde was talking to the doctor, and felt the truth of it in a way that went all the way down. Late in October, when the heat had finally broken and the desert was showing its autumn face, all cooler air and slanted golden light, Roscoe Dant came to her property. He came alone and on foot, which was unusual enough that she watched him approach from the porch with her hand near the derringer in her coat pocket. He stopped at the gate and took off his hat, which was more unusual still. "Miss Ford," he said, "I wonder if I might have a word." She studied him a moment. "Come up," she said, and he came up the path and stood near the porch steps. "I want to tell you something I should have said some time ago," he said, and he said it with the manner of a man who is not accustomed to saying difficult things, but has decided to be better than his habits. "I behaved poorly when you first came here. I was angry and I took that anger out in ways that were wrong. The fence was my responsibility whether I ordered it or not because it came from my ranch. She waited. You have been a good neighbor since you arrived, he said. Better than I deserved. I wanted to acknowledge that. She looked at him for a moment. Thank you, Mr. Dance, she said. That means something to me. He nodded, put his hat back on, and turned to go. He was halfway down the path when she said, Mr. Dance. He stopped and turned. My late uncle used to play cards on Thursday evenings, she said. With your father, I believe, and some others. I do not know if that tradition is still alive. Dant was quiet for a moment, and something shifted in his broad face, something old and a little sad. I believe the last Thursday game broke up when Harold passed, he said. Well, she said, I do not play cards myself, but I know a man who does. She did not need to specify. A flicker of understanding crossed Dant's face, and he nodded once, and she thought that perhaps things in Dusty Creek were not entirely what they had been and were not yet what they would become, but they were moving in a direction that was better than the one they had started from. She told Clyde about the exchange that evening, and he sat with it quietly and then said, That was generous of you. He apologized, she said simply. What was I going to do, hold it over him? A lot of people would. A lot of people are less tired than I am, she said, and he laughed, and she thought she would spend the rest of her life listening to him laugh if she had any say in the matter. She had say in the matter as it turned out. He asked her to marry him in November, on a cold, clear morning when they were riding along the creek, and he did it with a directness that was entirely characteristic of him, pulling his horse to a stop and looking at her and saying, Jennie, I want to ask you to marry me, and I want to do it with full honesty, which means I want to tell you what I can offer you and what I cannot. She stopped her horse and looked at him. I can offer you someone who will work beside you, not ahead of you or behind you, he said. I can offer you a man who will say what he means and mean what he says. I am not a wealthy man. I have my work and I have my horses and I have a house that is considerably smaller than your current establishment and probably needs a new roof within the next 2 winters. I am not a man who is going to be easy about everything because I have opinions and I do not always know when to keep them to myself. And I love you in a way that I do not think is going to change or decrease or become convenient, which is not a warning. I mean it as a promise. She was looking at him through the entire speech with an expression that she was aware probably gave everything away. Yes, she said, I have not finished the offer. Yes, she said again, and then she laughed. Clyde, yes. Wholeheartedly, with full information, and without reservation. Yes. He reached across the space between the horses and took her hand and held it for a moment, and his eyes were bright in a way she had not seen before, and she thought this was probably what her face had looked like all those mornings on the east fence when she had been looking at the mountains and thinking she was exactly where she was supposed to be. They were married in December in the small leaning church, on a cold morning when the sky was the deep blue that it only gets in winter in the territory. Clara Briggs stood with Jennie, and Pete Castillo stood with Clyde. Mrs. Garrett occupied the front pew and cried with the wholehearted efficiency of someone who had been expecting this event for months and was gratified to see it occurring. Amos the baker had made the wedding cake, which was magnificent, and the whole town came because that was the kind of place Dusty Creek was, and because a wedding was a reason to celebrate, and reasons to celebrate were not something anyone in the territory was in the habit of turning down. Roscoe Dant came. He sat in the back and left before the reception, but he had come, and Jennie noticed. The minister, a tired, kind man named Father Ellsworth who had been in the territory for 30 years, and had married more people than he could count and buried more than he wanted to count, said the words over them with a sincerity that made them feel like more than words. And when Clyde turned to her, and she saw his face in the cold winter light, clear and honest and wholly present, she understood something she had been circling for months, which was that love that is built slowly on honesty and work, and the daily choice to show up is different from love that arrives all at once, and that the difference is not that one is lesser, but that what she and Clyde had was something you could trust the way you trust a well-built structure. Because you have watched it go up, and you know every joint. They moved into his house first, because hers needed more winter preparation, and she discovered that his house, while small, was orderly in the way of a person who cares about his space, with books on a shelf and a good wood stove and a kitchen that was functional if minimal. She made it theirs in the incremental way that is the best and only real way of making something shared. They spent the rest of the winter working, because the land never fully releases you, and talking, because they were people who liked to talk to each other, and learning each other in the specific way that is only possible when you share a life. In the spring, they moved operations to her property, which was the larger of the two and had better water access, and Clyde began bringing his horses there. He had 6 horses that he worked and trained, and he had agreements with several ranchers in the county to provide trained mounts, and with Jennie's land and her practical management and her surprising ability to keep accounts, the work grew into something that felt genuinely like a future. It was in that first spring of their marriage that Clyde came home from a trip to the county seat with a particular expression, one that she had not seen before and could not immediately read. "What happened?" she said, standing at the corral gate. "I spoke to the land registrar," he said. "There was an inquiry at the county level about the Ford property, old inquiry, filed 2 years ago by Dance's lawyer. The registrar showed it to me because my name is on record as neighbor." He paused. "It was dismissed, fully. Your deed is confirmed and it is never going to be in question again." She looked at him. "I thought you would want to know," he said. She laughed, and the sound of it surprised her again the way it sometimes did, the freedom of it. "I already knew it was never going to be in question," she said. "Did you?" "I decided it was not going to be," she said. "On the first morning I stood here." He came through the gate and kissed her in the way that they kissed now, familiar and warm, and with a depth that had not diminished for being familiar. And she put her hands on his chest and felt his heartbeat, steady and strong, and thought that this was what it was supposed to feel like to be exactly where you were supposed to be. The territory in 1879 was not without its difficulties, and Jennie and Clyde were not without theirs. There was a dry summer that threatened the kitchen garden and required strategic irrigation, and they worked side by side on it for days. There was a disagreement, a significant one, about whether to sell the eastern 5 acres to the Ray's family for their expanding farm, or to keep it for their own future use, and they argued about it with the full force of their respective opinions for the better part of a week before arriving at a solution that pleased both of them, which was to offer the Ray's family a long-term lease rather than a sale. There was an illness in October, when Jennie came down with a fever that laid her flat for 9 days, and that scared Clyde in a way he showed not by hovering, but by being entirely present in the particular steady way of his, bringing broth and fresh water and reading aloud to her from the books on the shelf when she was too tired to read herself. She recovered completely, and emerged from the sick room slightly thinner and considerably more aware of what she had, which was considerable. And it was in the following spring, 1880, that she told Clyde she was going to have a child. She told him in the morning, at the kitchen table, with the directness she brought to everything important. He sat still for a moment in a way that she had learned to recognize as the way he processed large things, and then he reached across the table and took both her hands in his and held them and looked at her with an expression that had no words available for it. "Are you all right?" was what he said. "I am more than all right," she said. "I am frightened and happy, and I think it is probably too soon to tell anyone else, but I needed to tell you immediately." "Of course immediately," he said, and his voice was a little unsteady, which was not a thing she had heard very often. "This is me. You tell me everything immediately." She squeezed his hands. "I do." The pregnancy went smoothly enough, in the way that pregnancies in the territory went, which was to say with attention and the help of Dr. Holly's and the practical assistance of several women in the community, including Mrs. Garrett, who appointed herself to the project with enormous enthusiasm, and Maria raises mother Consuelo, who had delivered enough babies in the valley to have strong and well-founded opinions about how it ought to be done. Clyde was not the kind of man who became useless in the face of domestic things, which was a quality Jennie had come to appreciate deeply. He adapted to the changes in her schedule and her energy, and her capacity for physical work with the same practical attentiveness he brought to everything, taking on more of the heavy work without any performance of sacrifice, simply doing it because it needed doing and it was his to do. In October of 1880, 3 weeks earlier than Dr. Hollis's estimate, Jennie delivered a son. He arrived in the early morning before full light and was loud about his arrival, which Consuelo Reyes said was a good sign. He was healthy and round-faced and had, against all genetic probability, his father's blue-gray eyes. Clyde came in when it was over and the baby was cleaned and Jennie was exhausted and entirely clear-headed at the same time, the way a person is after something that requires everything they have, and he sat on the edge of the bed, and she put the baby in his arms and watched his face. He looked down at his son with an expression that she was going to keep in her memory for the rest of her life, and he said nothing for a long moment, and then he said very quietly, "Hello, William." They had agreed on William a month earlier, for no particular reason other than that they both liked the weight of it. "Hello, William," she agreed. Clyde looked up at her then, and she had never seen him look quite like that before, with all of his considerable self-containment set aside and everything simply there, plain as daylight. "Thank you," he said. "We both participated," she said. He laughed, and the baby startled at the sound and then seemed to decide it was acceptable and settled again. William Harold Alden, because of course his middle name was Harold, grew into a vigorous child who walked at 11 months and talked early and persistently, with strong opinions about horses and no patience for sitting still, which were qualities Jennie recognized as having come from both sides of his inheritance. He followed his father around the corral before he was 2, trying to replicate with small grave seriousness everything he saw Clyde do, and he followed his mother around the kitchen garden with the same seriousness, picking things that were not ready to be picked, and being gently informed why. The ranch became, over the years that followed, something that Jennie had only half imagined that first morning she had stood at the east fence looking at the mountains. It was not large, but it was well-ordered and well-loved, with Clyde's horse training operation growing steadily and her own management of the land producing enough that they were comfortable without being wealthy, which was exactly what she had wanted. The house expanded, a new room added when William was 3, and again when Jennie was pregnant a second time. Their second child was born in 1883, a daughter they named Eleanor, who arrived with considerably more composure than her brother and looked at the world from her first moments with the calm, assessing expression of a person who is taking it all in before deciding what to do about it. She had her mother's dark hair and her father's patient quality, and she and William had the particular bond of children who genuinely like each other, which is not something you can engineer but which is, when it occurs, one of the finest things. In the summer of 1884, Clyde made a decision. He had been offered a contract by a rancher in the north of the county, a substantial operation, to provide 15 trained horses per year for a period of 3 years. It was more horses than he had ever been contracted for at once, and it would require expansion of their facilities and possibly taking on a hand. He brought it to Jennie as he brought everything significant, not as a thing already decided but as something to think through together. They sat at the kitchen table long after the children were in bed, working through the numbers by lamplight, and Jennie thought about it with the same attention she had given her accounts for years, and she said yes, they could do it, and they should, because the work was there and the capacity was nearly there and the rest they could build. He looked at her across the table with the lamp between them and said, "I have been thinking about something. Tell me." "I have been thinking that you came out here 6 years ago with a carpetbag and a deed, and no particular reason to trust anything about this place," he said. "And you built a life here that is better than anything either of us had before. And I have been thinking that I would not have the life I have without you in it. And I know I have told you that before, but I want to tell you again, because things that are true should be said more than once." She looked at him in the lamplight, this man who was as familiar to her now as her own heartbeat and still capable of surprising her. "I came here because I had nowhere better to go," she said, "and I stayed because I found something I did not know I was looking for, which was a place and a person worth staying for." She paused. "You should also know that you are the best thing that has ever happened to me, and I am including the land in that assessment. I am better than 40 acres of New Mexico territory," he said. "Significantly," she said, and he laughed, and she laughed with him. And in the next room William and Alina slept, and outside the stars were thick over the desert, and the wind moved through the dry grass with its familiar voice, and the lamp burned steadily between them. They hired a hand the following spring, a young man named Daniel Cole, who came from Arizona, and who was good with horses and better than his age, suggested with the hard and various work of a ranch. He was 22 and serious, and a little lost in the way of young men who have been working since childhood, and have not yet found the thing they are working toward. And Jennie recognized something in him that she recognized from her own earlier self, and she and Clyde made a point of being the kind of employers who treated their people as people, which in 1885 in the territory was not as universal a practice as it should have been. The spring was a good one, the creek running high from a wetter-than-usual winter, the grass coming in green and strong across the grazing land. William was 5 and Alina 2, and the household had the particular quality of a place where there is always something happening, some small comedy or small crisis, some question that needs answering or some wonder that has been discovered. One evening in May, sitting on the porch in the long light, William in the yard with a stick that he was using as an imaginary horse and Alina asleep inside with Consuelo Reyes, who had come to sit with her while Jennie had the rare luxury of doing nothing for an hour, Jennie turned to Clyde and said, "Are you happy?" It was not an anxious question. It was genuine curiosity, the kind that comes from someone who is happy themselves and wants to know if the person beside them is equally well. He looked at her with that blue-gray gaze that had been looking at her for 7 years and still had the power to make her feel fully seen. "I am," he said. "Are you?" "Beyond what I thought possible," she said, and meant it entirely. He reached over and took her hand and held it on the arm of his chair, and they sat and watched William in the yard being an imaginary horse with the grave commitment of a 5-year-old who has not yet learned that imagination requires apology. And the evening light fell over everything, over the land and the mountains and the long grass and the house, and the two people on the porch who had found each other in a dusty town in the territory, and had made something real and good and lasting out of it. The land was hers and his and theirs. The children were theirs. The life was theirs, built from the beginning with honesty and work, and the daily courage of choosing the same thing over and over, which is the only way love of the enduring kind is ever built. Dusty Creek changed slowly the way small towns change, gathering a few more buildings and a few more families, losing a few to somewhere else. The leaning church got repaired and stood straight. Clara Briggs got her new schoolhouse, which she promptly filled with students, including Maria Reyes, who had become her assistant teacher and was as sharp and precise as Clara herself had hoped. Mrs. Garrett took in fewer boarders as the years passed, but she remained the social and practical heart of the community, and she remained one of Jennie's closest friends, arriving on Sunday afternoons with opinions and coffee cake and the comfortable assumption that she was always welcome. Roscoe Dant's ranch passed to his son after Dant died of a stroke in the winter of 1886. His son was a different man from his father, quieter and with a natural friendliness that his father had never quite possessed. He and Clyde had the easy relationship of neighboring ranchers who respected each other's work, and the old bitterness of the land dispute belonged so thoroughly to the past that it was more story than wound. In 1887, Jennie and Clyde added a third child to their family, another son, born in the summer and named for Clyde's father, Thomas. Thomas arrived with the specific personality of a child who has been born into a family that already has its equilibrium, and who therefore feels no need to establish his own territory urgently. He was a calm, observant baby who grew into a calm, observant child who watched the horses in the corral with the same quality of attention his father had, and who at 3 years old sat beside his father in the corral without being asked and watched a young mare being worked and said, in a voice of clear and considered judgment, "She is scared." Clyde had looked at his son for a moment and then looked at the mare and said, "She is." "How did you know?" "Her ears," Thomas said. Clyde had looked at Jennie over the fence with an expression that she understood completely, and she had smiled, because some things are simply given from one person to another across a generation, and there is nothing more right about the world than watching it happen. They did not have more children after Thomas, and they were content with the 3 they had, who were distinct and vivid, and entirely their own people in the way of children who have grown up in a home where they are genuinely known. William, at 7, was bold and physical and full of questions that required research. Eleanor, at 4, was precise and verbal, and had a talent for the kind of clear-eyed observation that Jennie recognized as coming directly from herself. Thomas, at 2, was quiet and attentive, and already horse-mad in the particular way that suggested he had not chosen this but had been chosen. The ranch in the late 1880s was, by the standards of the territory, a success. Not a grand one, not the kind that people wrote about in Eastern newspapers. The kind that is built quietly and maintained through consistent work. The kind that a person returns to at the end of the day with gratitude rather than dread. Clyde's horse training was well regarded across 3 counties, and Jennie had begun selling the produce from her kitchen garden and the honey from the 4 beehives she had established, the money from which went into a small account she kept specifically for the children's education, about which she had strong and early opinions. In the evenings, when the children were in bed and Daniel Cole had gone to his bunk in the small building off the barn, and the ranch was quiet with that particular quality of evening quiet that is not emptiness but presence, Jennie and Clyde sat on the porch with coffee, and sometimes they talked and sometimes they did not. Both were fine. Both were full. There were still hard things. The territory in the 1880s was a place of genuine difficulty, where the government's treatment of the Apache and other indigenous peoples was a persistent and grievous wrong that affected everyone in the region, the violence and the displacement, and the injustice of it pressing against the ordinary lives of settlers who were themselves part of a larger system that Jennie, particularly, did not think about without a sense of discomfort. She had no simple resolution to it, no action that felt adequate to the scale of it. What she did was try to be honest about it when the subject arose, and to treat the people she encountered with the respect she felt she owed to every person regardless of what the prevailing culture suggested about that, and to raise her children to understand that the land they lived on had a history longer than their family's 3 years on it. It was not enough, and she knew it was not enough, but it was what she had, and she gave it honestly. The autumn of 1889 was the year that New Mexico Territory took its first formal steps toward statehood, a process that would take decades, but that had already begun to shift the political character of the region. There was much discussion in Dusty Creek about what statehood would mean, about law and land and representation, and Jennie sat in those conversations with the authority of a woman who had owned and worked land here for 11 years, and who was not prepared to be spoken over. She was not always heard in those conversations the way she deserved to be heard, because 1889 was 1889, and the territory was the territory, and a woman's property rights and voice in civic matters were contested in ways that were infuriating, and that she fought, with her characteristic steadiness, in every way available to her. She spoke at town meetings. She corresponded with other women in the territory who were engaged in the same arguments. She made sure her children understood what she was doing and why. Clyde stood with her in all of it, and not in the way of a man who is being gracious about his wife's interests, but in the way of a person who shares the beliefs and sees the point, and says so clearly when asked and sometimes when not asked, because some things are more important than the discomfort of saying them. Clara Briggs, at a town meeting in November of 1889, gave a speech about women's suffrage that was received with everything from admiration to hostility, and Jennie had walked up to her afterward and said, "That was exactly right," and Clara had said, "I know, and I am going to keep saying it until the room runs out of reasons to disagree." "I will be there when you do," Jennie said. "I know that too," Clara said. On an evening in December of that year, Jennie and Clyde sat on the porch in the cold with blankets across their laps and coffee steaming in their hands, and William, who was now 9 and had recently developed the habit of asking large questions without warning, came to the door and said, "Papa, how did you and Mama decide to get married?" Clyde looked at Jennie. Jennie looked at Clyde. "Come sit down," Clyde said, and William came and sat on the step between them. "Your mother arrived in this town with a carpetbag and more courage than most people I have ever met," Clyde said. "And I saw her face down a difficult man on her first morning here, and I thought, that is a person I want to know better. And then," William said, "and then I kept finding reasons to come to her property," Clyde said, "until I ran out of pretenses and had to admit the real reason." "What was the real reason?" "That I was completely and helplessly in love with her," Clyde said plainly, in the tone of a man stating a well-established fact. William considered this. "That seems reasonable," he said. "Thank you," Clyde said. Jennie reached over and touched Clyde's hand under the blanket, and he turned his palm up and laced his fingers through hers. "What about you, Mama?" William said. "When did you decide?" "In a livery stable on my second morning in Dusty Creek," she said. "Your father was being patient with a nervous horse." "That is romantic," William said with the skepticism of a 9-year-old who has opinions about things. "Everything about how a person treats a creature that depends on them tells you exactly who they are," she said. "So yes, that was romantic." William sat with this information. "I am going to tell Alina that," he said. "She asked me this morning why you and Papa look at each other the way you do, and I did not know what to say." "What does she think we look like?" Jennie asked. "Like you are both thinking about the same thing at the same time," William said. "She said it all the time." Clyde looked at Jennie and Jennie looked at Clyde, and they were, in fact, thinking about the same thing at the same time, which was that they had built exactly the life they had wanted without having known at the beginning precisely what they were building toward, and that it was more than either of them had allowed themselves to hope for. "Go inside," Jennie said to William. "It is cold and you will catch a chill." "You are both outside," he pointed out. "We are adults," she said. "We have made various poor decisions about temperature over the years and have earned the right to continue." He went inside, clearly unconvinced, and they heard him telling Alina something in the room beyond, the sound of their children's voices carrying through the walls of the house they had made together. The stars were out in force over the desert, the way they are in the territory in winter when the air is cold and clear, brilliant and improbable, too many to count and giving it anyway. "Are you cold?" Clyde said. "A little," she said. He shifted his blanket and she moved close to him on the bench, and he put the blanket around them both, and they sat there under the stars with the cold and the heat of each other, and the sound of their children's voices and the land around them, quiet and full and entirely, completely theirs. She thought about the morning she had arrived in Dusty Creek, the stagecoach and the dust, and the knowledge that she had come too far to go back, and not yet far enough to know what was ahead. She thought about the walk to the livery, and the nervous mare, and the man in the leather vest, who had spoken to the horse with patient honesty, and then turned and looked at her with the same quality of attention. She thought about the deed in her boot and the land at the edge of town, and the 40 acres that had become, over 11 years, the thing that held all the rest of her life. She thought about the fences and the garden and the creek and the horses in the corral, and the 3 children inside the house and the man beside her, whose heartbeat she could feel through the blanket and through the arm against hers. She thought about the fact that she had come here with nothing that she knew how to name, only a need to be somewhere that was truly hers, and she had found that, and more than that, she had found what she had not known to look for, which was a person who wanted to be in that same place for the same reasons and who had looked at her and seen her clearly from the first and had never once looked away. "Clyde," she said. He said, warm and present. "Thank you for coming back to this place," she said. "When you were 21 and you went north and could have stayed, thank you for coming back." He turned his head to look at her, and his eyes in the dark were the color of the sky that it is just before full light, that blue-gray that is between night and morning. "I was always going to come back," he said. "I just needed to know it for myself." "I know," she said. "I am still glad." He kissed her temple and she leaned into him, and they sat like that while the stars moved in their enormous slow arcs overhead. And inside the house, William and Alina argued about something small and Thomas slept. And outside, the desert breathed its cold night breath over everything. And the 40 acres of land that Jennie Ford had come to claim and had found to be more than land, it was a life, lay around them in the dark. Steady and real and full of all the living they had done and all the living still to come. It was enough. It was, in fact, everything.